terrible sometimes. Once upon a time, there was a little boy who lived in a busy little village. At the center of the village were bustling shops and businesses, and on the edge of the village was a river that wound casually along the edge of a forest that was dotted with houses. And all day, every day, people from the village and from the forest would cross over little arched stone bridges across the river on their way to the bank or the bakery or the blacksmith. And as they crossed the bridge, they would stop and drop a pebble into the water for good luck or to remember something that was important to them. And one day, after a heavy rain, a boy in the village, this boy that I was talking about, was playing on one of the bridges. His best friend was home with a cold, because that's what we should all do when we're not feeling well. And he was bored. So he started throwing leaves into the water and watching how fast the water would take them away. But that didn't hold his interest very long, so he started walking on the stone wall on the edge of the bridge, with the road on one side and the water down below on the other side. And even though it was a very risky thing to do, he got bored pretty quickly. So as he reached the end, there was a tree hanging low, and he grabbed onto one of the tree branches, figuring it would hold his weight. And it did, kind of, but his feet left the bridge and he went down slowly toward the water, and he was holding on, but after a while, he couldn't hold on anymore. And he crashed into the water. And the water was moving really fast, and he moved about 20 feet, and he grabbed onto a bush, and he was holding on, and he started screaming, "Help! Help!" And as he shouted, people ignored him. He just kept shouting, "Help! Help!" And he was just holding onto that bush. Now, it was a busy village, and those bridges were well traveled, and people saw what was going on. One passer went by, and she saw him, and she heard him, and she pretended that she didn't see him, like he wasn't there. And another passerby went over to the wall, and as the boy shouted, "Help! Help!" he just shook his head and walked away. And another passerby stopped. And as the boy shouted, "Help! Help!" he just held up his hand as if to say, "Stop talking, because I'm not listening." So the boy stopped yelling. And after a moment, the man said, "You got yourself into this mess. How are you going to get yourself out of it?" Now, our boy may have been reckless, but he was also very bright. So he just calmed himself down, still holding on to that bush against the current, and he said as humbly as he could, "Please, sir, help me now. And when I'm safe, you can scold me for as long as you want." Doesn't life feel like that sometimes? Right? Like we're just going about our business, trying to find a little joy, maybe even some excitement, and then we get ourselves into a little trouble, and we find ourselves in situations where we could use a little accompaniment, maybe even a little help, and instead we get judgment. And if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes we're the ones doing the judging. Even when we don't want to, sometimes we judge when we're trying to be helpful. And so we come together on Sundays, here, together, not because we're perfect and we want to show off how smart and non-judgmental we are, but because we want to practice taking risks with each other, helping each other when we need it, and maybe even keeping our opinions to ourselves when necessary. We come here to practice. And one of the ways we practice is to recite our covenant together. So let's rise now and do just that. And if you don't know the words, they're printed in your order of service. Love is the spirit of this congregation, and service is our prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
I've been thinking a lot about water this summer, And when I was in Portland, I was staying with really dear friends, and they brought up Taoism to me, and were, just telling me about how to kind of follow the way of water through a Taoist perspective. We had a long conversation about it, and at the end of it, my friend sat down on his computer and ordered me the Tao Te Ching and the I Ching that arrived 2 days later via the miracle of Amazon. And so now I have these really, these books that are adding a lot to my life. So, in the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu, who's credited with writing that, said, "Water is fluid, soft, and yielding, but water will wear away rock, which is rigid and cannot yield. As a rule, whatever is fluid, soft, and yielding will overcome whatever is hard and rigid. This is another paradox. What is soft is strong." So the way of water, to me, most simply, is going with the flow. But that doesn't mean that we just bend and move to whatever will comes and shakes our foundation. We're not tossed around by the current. Going with the flow still requires a lot of intention and focus. Just like an Aikido warrior or a judo master, karate kid, there's this simple twist of a wrist and step to the side, and you can use the momentum of your opponent to bring them to the ground. And that's the thing about water, it never actually fights. It carves these massive canyons, but it doesn't do it by punching and smashing and explosions. It does it by patiently staying its course. And sometimes this is what life calls for, patient commitment. And sometimes life presents us with big challenges, like a big obstruction in the stream of your life, something that calls for action. But even if this challenge feels like a dam that has completely shut off your flow, leaving you no options and no way out, eventually with time, the water does find a way through. Maybe it fills a deep pool and eventually spills over the top of that dam. Or maybe it finds a way around it, diverts itself and goes a different direction. Or maybe it finds the tiny cracks in that dam that seemed like they weren't even there and really patiently wears away those cracks until it finds all of the ways through. And maybe, maybe it just evaporates and goes and finds another place to rain down where it's more welcome. So going with the flow can mean a lot of different things in different situations. And sometimes it means staying the course and finding those cracks with patient compassion. Sometimes it means finding an alternate route. Sometimes it's working with the obstacle and finding the soft spots and helping reshape that obstacle into something else that softens and becomes part of that stream. So I invite you to imagine yourself as an ocean. If you would like to close your eyes, you can. See yourself spreading out to the horizon. Imagine your body is part of this ocean and that you are this vast liquid slowly undulating with the current. Now see if you can imagine a little kid standing on the edge of your ocean playing in the waves. That little kid is very mad. It has all this anger inside of them, and they're trying to let it out. So they're kicking at your water, they're thrashing on the side of your ocean, and punching it, and shoving it. And if you were a parent or another little kid on the side of the ocean, you might be very upset and concerned, but you are the ocean. A shove to your shore means nothing to you. The ocean just looks on with placid compassion. So I just invite you to look at that tiny creature, feeling very angry, and gently hold them until they have felt what they need to feel. And that little person could also be a part of you, a little piece of yourself that feels those triggers and feels those urges to get angry. And I just invite you, and that little child self in you, I invite you to just hold that space of compassion It's okay to feel those big feelings. So if someone brings their anger at you and tries to throw it at you, or you feel it rising up in yourself, and it brings you into this unbalanced energy, it feels like this big emotion has just been dumped on you, remember that you are like the ocean. Those emotions are not yours, and you can let them wash away. And if it is your emotion, you can hold space for it and feel it until it smooths out. So those toxins, they dissipate in your vastness. And the magic of water is that you don't even have to try. You don't have to strive and struggle to dilute and disperse. You just simply are. Just simply by being, it transmutes it. Simply by existing, it flows. So I invite you to seek this depth and embody this flow. And I'll leave you with another question from Lao Tzu. Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? Can you remain unmoving until the right action arises by itself? So with another moment of breathing, I invite you to create this gesture with your hands. One hand, one palm out and up, and one palm facing forward. This is the mudra of no fear. I just learned it yesterday, and it was really powerful, so I'm adding it in. It's a posture of giving and receiving without grasping. So let's just breathe for a moment in this.
Please stand and join us in the hymn.
The Taunton River is one of those post-industrial waterways that has seen a lot. 150 years ago, it functioned the way interstate highways function today. It was clogged with ships going to and from the Atlantic Ocean, especially in the cities of Fall River, Taunton, and Raynham. It used to be lined with factories, boatyards, and warehouses. If it didn't catch fire in the 1960s, it probably should have. It's a lot cleaner these days, but I still wouldn't swim in it. I wouldn't even paddle my kayak in it, except that it meanders through the shade of the trees that lines it, which usually means that it would have a light current into which I can put my boat and paddle for hours and then turn around and come back without too much effort. I was thrilled when I finally discovered it within the river, a place where I could put my kayak in at Weir Park in the city of Taunton. The first day I watched as leaves slowly passed by on the water, heading south toward the ocean. So I jumped in and headed north against the mild current. I paddled for about an hour, and then I turned around, and I was surprised that it took me only 20 minutes to get back to where I started. But clearly, the current was a lot stronger than I thought it was. The next day I went back, and without paying much attention, I headed north again, and was surprised that after paddling for 40 minutes, it took me more than an hour to get back to the boat ramp. But I didn't pay too much attention to it. Well, on the third day, I took my dear husband Joe's advice. I took him up on his offer to drop me off way up in Raynham, about 5 miles north of Weir, and meet me downstream about 7 miles south of the park in the town of Somerset. So that would be a 12-plus mile trip. And I was excited because I don't usually get the chance to paddle downstream for a long time. It meant I'd be able to relax a little and really enjoy the scenery. It started off great. I was zipping along at the mind-blowing rate of about 3 miles per hour without putting much physical effort into it. And I saw really cool houses kind of hovering over the river, and some restaurant patios that looked kind of neat, and a few boats, and a family of swans, and some gorgeous blue herons, a very industrious beaver, and several fishermen. It was lovely. It was the perfect journey. But somewhere along the line, before I got to Weir Park, I found that I was having to put some real effort into paddling. And then the wind picked up. It was strong wind, and this wasn't wind at my back helping me along, this was wind at my face, making it more difficult, and I was paddling against it hard. And the further I went, the more I had to struggle. And after a while, maybe an hour of that, it felt like I was getting nowhere, paddling furiously just to keep from moving backward. I could see that I was getting somewhere, but it was slow. And it was exhausting, and I was sweating like crazy. And honestly, I was a little worried. I thought about calling Joe, and I knew I could call Joe and have him meet me back at Weir. I knew I could just turn around and be back at Weir in no time. But I kept pushing forward and finally met him in Somerset. A couple days later, I was back at the river ready to take off when another boater ran up to me asking me about my experience of the water quality. And we talked for a bit, and he told me about the current and how it changes with the tides of the ocean. Now, before coming out that morning, he had spent weeks researching the tide changes and trying to figure out when the current would reverse at that spot in Taunton. Because what he wanted to do was ride with the current in both directions. Weeks he spent researching this, right? Now, the thing is that I knew that river currents could reverse. I mean, I've heard of places where you can ride the rapids in both directions, depending on timing. But never having lived on a river so close to the ocean before, I had no idea that it could happen 20 miles up the river. I mean, that was really shocking to me, and it explained everything. On my long trip toward the end, I wasn't paddling against the wind, I was paddling against the current. And that had changed direction. Like, mind blown. I felt kind of foolish, though, not knowing that in advance, I have to admit. But the thing is, had I known, I probably would have done the thing that other kayaker did. I would have been intimidated by the river, and I would have spent a lot of time trying to manage its flow, or at least manage my experience of its flow. I would have researched tide charts to find non-existent information online about the best time to paddle in the Taunton on any given day. And in the meantime, I would have been, well, not paddling. By just getting into the river and doing it, I learned a lot more than if I'd been online or trying to get the advice of every paddler in eastern Massachusetts. And that's how I try to live my life. I do a thing, and then I research it. I try a new activity, then I learn more about the process as I do it, right? Or I go to a place and read up on everything that interests me while I'm there, which usually leads to more research and a better visit the next time. In fact, it ensures that I'll go back the second time. Because you know what? When I research it in advance, I get there thinking, oh, I know everything about this place. And I don't see it for what it is. So I've learned, just go with the flow. You know, sometimes going with the flow looks chaotic. Sometimes you're sweating profusely and a little worried that you're going backward. But it's a lot of fun and a lot more interesting in the long run. So I'd like to invite you to please rise now as you're willing and able, and open your blue hymnal this time